It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this first Social Science Educational Lecture Talk of the 2015-16 season. And my name is Nina Rosenstand, and I'm a professor of philosophy here at Mesa, and I chair this series as I've been doing for 12 years now. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the speaker of the day. He is our own Cesar Lopez, and he is a professor of Chicana and Chicano Studies here at Mesa College, as you can see that it says right there. And he received his doctorate and his master's degrees in ethnic studies from the University of California in Berkeley. And he is teaching courses here in Chicano and Chicana history, and film and culture, and introduction to Chicana/Chicano studies. And his current research project, he has several of them, and he's working with one focusing on oral histories of merchants on Olivera Street in LA, and also student campus activism at the University of Southern California from the 1960s to the 1990s, including several ethnicities. He tells me that he was first inspired to attend college by the example of his mother, who was a first-generation community college graduate, and both of his parents are from Mexico City and from Monterrey, Mexico. And he was born in East LA, so homegrown. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Cesar Lopez.
Thank you. Welcome everyone. Good afternoon on this hot afternoon, but it's nice and cool in here. And in a little bit, I'm actually going to be turning down the lights a little so you can see my presentation a little better, because I've kind of tailored it to my audience, and I want to make sure that I include portions of this that are part of a publication that I wrote on this work that emanates from my dissertation, but also there's a lot of maps and other pictures that I want to kind of entertain you with as well. So I'll be getting started, but also just want to thank the Occasional Social Science Lecture Series, the Social Sciences Department, Professor Rosenthal, for inviting me. Professor John McLeod is here as well. Thank you very much.
Stephen Pacheco.
Oh, Stephen Pacheco. Hello. And I wanted to start with just kind of, dedicating this talk to the 10 students that tragically we lost on October the 1st up in Oregon. Was it Oregon? Oregon, right? At Upunka Community College. And I just heard in the news of another a shooting at another college in Arizona. And in Texas. So it's happening all over. I think, and I say that because we're all brothers and sisters, especially here at the community college, but because my talk deals with issues of violence and issues of kind of these outpours of violence or these flashes of violence, but also issues of systemic violence. So in the talk the history that I'm going to be looking at, the layers of it kind of piece together the story of Mexicans and Chinese in the history of the Plaza area of Los Angeles, but it also looks at changes in the built environment, the physical environment, and the communities, right, in terms of how they interacted and how they grew together. So some of the things you'll see here speak to those notions of different levels of violence, systemic, real, symbolic as well. Okay, so let me just start first with this image here. It's a beautiful image of a mural that was painted at the University of Southern California back in the mid-90s. And I put it there as kind of an inspiration, reminder to me. I did my undergraduate degree there, went on to do my doctoral work and my master's degree at UC Berkeley in ethnic studies. But for me, part of this research and this project began with this mural. Right? As an undergraduate student at USC, I was part of a group of students that helped to bring this mural to life, do the research, protest, right? And I also kind of bring awareness to the fact that the University of Southern California needed to do more to reflect some of the diversity of the campus and of the community. And so this was post, LA Uprising, right, 1992. And USC sits at the heart of South Los Angeles, or it's called South Central Los Angeles. But like I said, so part of the story here is a story that starts with the university And so here's a kiva, kind of an entry point into the piece, and this is a marker, a keystone that's located at the entry point to the Doheny Library on campus. So how many people have been to USC? Okay. So if you've been there, if you haven't been there, it's a wonderful place to visit, right across the street from Exposition Park. A lot of things to see there. But we wanted to center the story of kind of layered history. Kind of, you can see the California landscape cut open and the layers of history, embedded in the land, as a story about the history of peoples, right, that have populated Southern California and in and around what became USC. And so part of, as I said, I can go on and on this piece, but the connection to this talk is that the story of Calle de los Negros, which is one of the streets that I'm going to be focusing on, which becomes a main street of the Chinatown of the original Los Angeles area, the research that I started with began here in this mural. And so from as an undergrad to graduate school and beyond, it's been a part of my life. And working with the artist Judy Baca, we brought her to campus here at Mesa College a couple of years ago and showed her work. She's a prominent Chicano muralist, artist, and professor at UCLA. So let me get started. So let me situate this first. Part of, some people may not be familiar with the Plaza area or even, parts of downtown Los Angeles. But the way that I kind of talk about this to people that aren't as familiar is kind of map it out a little bit. For my students, I say, well, any Dodger fans in the house, right? Boo, right? But it's located in and around Dodger Stadium. Is kind of up here. So if you're familiar in terms of baseball, downtown, the Hollywood Freeway runs right next to this area. Off of Main Street, you have City Hall, the current Chinatown on one side, the Union Station on another. And so this is officially known as the Pueblo de Los Angeles Historical Monument. So the way I kind of relate that to people that aren't familiar is think about like Old Town San Diego. Right? It's a historical place that's historically designated that is has a lot of layered history that can't really change. At least from the aesthetic part of it, it's meant to preserve that history forever. And so the physical markers of that are Alameda Street, the Hollywood Freeway, Spring Street, and Cesar Chavez Avenue. And so the streets that I'll be looking at and the area is the origins of this area, the Plaza area. So this is located right downtown LA. So the way that I also like to frame this when I talk about it is, if you haven't been there, then hopefully by the end of this talk, then you'll be inspired maybe to go check it out and do a road trip up to LA to learn about it. I want to also give a couple of slides on origins related to kind of the more ancient history of the Plaza. So instead of starting with the U.S. period, I want to go back just a little bit and mention, right, kind of the indigenous history, indigenous peoples that have populated the Plaza area for a very long time, right? The Yamna people, also known as the Gardere Indian people, the village, the site of the original Pueblo has been occupied, right, by peoples for generations and generations. The Gardereños were part of kind of a complex land and sea trading that interconnected different parts of Southern California, all the way north to the Santa Barbara area, the Chumash, to the east, right, the Coahuila and Mojave to the east, and the Pueblo and Lucenio in the south. Right? So there's complex interconnection, and we see that whenever we dig anywhere in Southern California, especially when you go into the mesas, right? Places like, for instance, on the west side, Loyola Marymount University is a nice spot, right? Because it's kind of on the west side, and you can see kind of the bluff there, and there's one of these places where it was kind of a trading ground, kind of like the history of this mesa, right? The mesas of this area, right? As we dig, and I'm sure as we're digging right now, we're finding things, right? Hopefully we're letting people know. But that there's a long history and a long interconnection there. 1542, Captain Juan Rodriguez Carrillo, right, discovers California while sailing the coastline. So this kind of presence, right, of the Southern California area, of Los Angeles, this kind of colonial presence begins to take shape, right, at least initially, right, all the way to 1602, right, Captain Sebastian Vizcano, right, explores California coast, right, drops anchor near the coast, right, so you have this kind of connections that we start to see and the names that start to sound familiar, but really it isn't until about 166 years later where we get to see more expanded colonization, exploration of kind of Alta California within the context of Spanish colonialism, right? So between 1765 and 1771, you begin to see kind of the interconnections of the institutions that begin to shape what becomes Alta California, from the mission system to the presidios to the pueblos. Right? One example of that, Father Juan Gresky's diary excerpt talking about the Los Angeles basin, right, coming into town or coming into the area, right? This is from Thursday, the third month, 1769. Right? At 6:30, we left the camp and forded the Porcilia River, which runs down the valley, flowing through it from the mountains into the plain. All of the soil is black and loomy and is capable of producing every kind of grain and fruit which may be planted. After traveling about half a league, we came to the village of the region, the people of which, on seeing us, came out into the road. Right? So this kind of beginnings, this connection, but also this representation that the indigenous population was already there, and had kind of already a connection to the specific areas that eventually become the Pueblo settlement. Right? So the official founding of the Pueblo, right, de la Reina de Los Angeles, is 1871, officially on September the 4th. And depending, LA history, Southern California history is fraught with different interpretations, different new nuances that people find. So the official founding is September the 4th, but there are stories and information that kind of cited a little earlier in different parts, because you had the settlement happen kind of in pieces in terms of people moving into the area from the different parts of the region. One of the things I want to mention is the design of the plaza. There is a mix that was created in terms of the orientation and the physical built environment of the plaza, and the influence being going back to the law of the Indies in terms of the physical layout and the laws that were followed in terms of where proportionally how the plaza was intended to be built out, where buildings could be located in spatial relation to government buildings, to church buildings, right? And also the influence of kind of indigenous pre-Columbian design, right, which you begin to see in terms of the importance of ceremonial centers, civic centers. So this kind of interconnection and weaving of influences, right, that scholars are looking at in terms of what eventually becomes the layout of this built environment throughout the Americas. So there's this kind of interconnection there. The plaza also in Los Angeles was moved at least twice. In 1801 and 1815, we have information about the LA River flooding, overflooding, right? And this original plaza was said to be closer to the river, so they moved it to higher land, right, a little further away. So the original, kind of quote, original site of the plaza is a bit, people have different interpretations of where that actually is, but it's different than where it is right now. All right, another part of this, sort of the early origins of the plaza are the pobladores, right? These are the founders of the Pueblo, right, going back to 1781. And so here's a list, right? This is a list of the founders' names. And in this list, it's interesting. It lists their caste, right? So in this, of course, in relation to the casta system, right? The caste system that was all-encompassing, controlling, really, of the and part and parcel of the Spanish colonial project, right? Depending on where you fit into the caste, into the casta, depending, really relegating your lot in life, right? If you were kind of like, the way I describe it's a pyramid, right? So at the top of it were European Spaniards from Spain, and then all below that is kind of this kind of intricate intermixing of different mixes of Europeans with indigenous, with African, and so on and so forth. Very intermixing and a very kind of complicated one if you look at all of the different mixings. But what it also tells us is their sex and their age. Right? And part of the mythology, that's celebrated in terms of the founding of the Pueblo. There's an annual celebration in early September 4th, that kind of reenacts, right, this founding, the walking from the San Gabriel Mission downtown to downtown LA, is this notion of kind of the Spanish purity, right? This kind of this kind of Spanish project, of the colonial project. Reality, if we look at the this list and we look at the names and we look at the casta, we find that only 2 are listed as kind of Spanish, and the rest are listed as mulattos, mulatas, Indias, right, Negros, right? So you have a majority of mixed African and indigenous ancestry. And so part of that, it just speaks to the complexity of the casta system. So in order to kind of understand that, you really kind of look at the casta and know that this kind of intermixing worked in a very different way than in the United States, right, in terms of kind of racialization of groups, where you racialize people as white or non-white, right, and then we kind of went from there. Within the casta, there was kind of movement back and forth, up and down. So depending on how you mixed, right, your offspring would be mixed differently. Either you would move up the casta, or you can move down the casta, or even off the casta chart. Right? So there's a great little pyramid of that I showed that kind of pushes people off the casta. All right, so the plan of the Pueblo. So here we go. So this is one of the early layouts, right? A map design of the Plaza. So there's the Plaza. You have the designation of the buildings around, in and around it. The LA River, right? The river bed. You have the area that's mapped out or cordoned off for agricultural development. Right? So this becomes an early connection. Oh, and the mother ditch, the Santa Madre, which runs adjacent to the Plaza. So an interconnection with the water source, with the land, and this kind of mapping out, the building out of the Pueblo, right, early on. Okay, so into the Mexican period. So here's a map, Mapa de los Estados Unidos de Mexico, right? This is a map of Mexico, right? So sometimes you look at it as like, oh, North America, right? So this is a map that encompasses, right, Texas, encompasses the today the U.S. Southwest, and portions of it along with Baja and the traditional parts of Mexico that we're more familiar with, right? But I like this map because it gives you a sense of kind of the broadness, like the context, right, of kind of Mexico pre-1848, right? Gives you a sense there. And here we are here, right there in San Diego on the tip of the edge there. So, and of course, within the context of Spanish colonialism and into the Mexican period, you had the center of power be kind of here down in central Mexico. Right? So this is kind of far away, or we were far away, right, from the center of power and kind of the nexus of the colonial project. Right? This was, of course, going into Alta California. But it's that disconnection that saw a different kind of variety of expansion and settlement, right? That was possible in other parts of central Mexico. So here, going into 1848, we go into the U.S. or beginnings, right, of the U.S. period. And this is a very famous map, the Ord map, which was the first commissioned map of the city of Los Angeles, right after the Mexican period. So it becomes this map that is controversial in a sense because it maps out the city, but it became very hard to actually use functionally. So they had to kind of go on to different versions almost immediately after it. But it lays out the center of the city, the plaza, the agricultural land, the rivers, right, and the beginnings, right, of what would be spread out into, right, the Pueblo de Los Angeles, or the city of Los Angeles. This is a map from 1853, the plaza once again. And this map is a survey map of the railroads, as the railroads were beginning to be kind of coming into this central part of Southern California. Part of this mapping was to figure out where exactly they would end up, and one of the places they kind of came into in crisscross was in this portion of downtown Los Angeles. But I like this map because it gives you, it's kind of like one of those tourist maps, right? It kind of marks off the buildings and it gives you names. And along with this map, there's actually narratives that were connected to it in terms of trying to tell a little bit about the story of who lived there, who was at the Pueblo at the time. So we start with the Plaza, right, bullfighting arena, Commodore Stockton's troops, marching in 1847, occupying the Casa Villa Adobe right there. And during the U.S.-Mexico War, right, you have the old church, right, from the 1820s. Right across, central to the plaza, the Campo Santo. So on each side of this, you have, right, the cemeteries, the Pico House, right, which in 1870 becomes kind of the last vestige of Pio Pico's wealth and and prestige, right? Yeah, there's adobes there as well, his family. The Lugo adobe, right, the first two-story adobe built in the Pueblo, right on the Plaza, right, Alameda Street there. All these buildings, right, are no longer there. The Hollywood Freeway runs through this. But what I want to just emphasize here is that here, into the U.S. period, the Plaza was still very much occupied, used, and owned by the Californios or the Mexicanos, or now Mexican Americans. Right? Main Street there, Calle de los Negros, key entry point on this side, right, and bordered by Alameda Street. Right? So this map kind of tells us a little bit about who lived there, and specifically, like I said, some of the pieces of this puzzle in terms of what the uses of were in terms of the maps and the different buildings, right, who lived there. So in this case, like I said, owned and occupied early on, right, into the U.S. period by prominent Californios. By 1871, right, so about 20 years later, an event happens in Los Angeles that shifts the focus, right, away from kind of the Mexicanos, the Californios. Right? In 1870, you have Pio Pico and the People House. By 1871, the street Calle de los Negros, right, one of the main entry points into the Plaza, had become the main street for the original Chinatown of the city. Right? So this original Chinatown in this area that was originally owned, right, the buildings by first a mixture of Californios, which included European American immigrants coming into Los Angeles, intermarriage, right? Eventually became the center of this area, became the center of the original Chinatown. The Chinatown today is located on this side. But in 1871, there's an example of early violence against the Chinese. It's really the 1880s and 1890s where we see this kind of upsurge of anti-Chinese sentiment and violence, right? All over the United States, from the West Coast to the East Coast. But LA, Los Angeles in 1871 provides an early example of violence directed specifically at the Chinese in terms of a mob riot that happens in 1871. And so there, put a little picture of a newspaper article, riot and massacre of the Chinese, right? Los Angeles, October 24th, 7 p.m. The quarrel among the Chinese, one case of which found its way into the courts yesterday, has become general and on the streets today. And in a Chinese quarter in Negro Alley and the vicinity, the excitement among them was noticeable. Right? So the story that goes along with the Chinese massacre is it's a story about a fight over a woman, right? Of course, you fight over a woman. This possession of a Chinese woman who was in guardianship of a Chinese Tong in San Francisco. So the story goes that she runs away, right, from the San Francisco Tong, comes to Los Angeles. It's a battle over her custody, a battle over family. The police get involved. There's actually court documents. There's court documents where the court, this matter was taken to court, and she was ruled that she had to go back to the Chinese Tong in San Francisco, right? They were her legal guardians. Well, it got into a skirmish in the streets of Calle de los Negros. The police got involved. I'm giving you kind of the short version of this. The police got involved. Gunshots were fired. A police officer was shot, and then everything broke loose. There was a mob riot, over 600 people participating from all over the Pueblo and the region, in English and in Spanish. And the Chinese were massacred. Between 18 and 21 Chinese were killed. This is at a time where the total population, Chinese population of the Pueblo was a little under 300, like 271 or so, something like that, in terms of the official numbers. So this was a massacre, right? This was something that all-out violence against the Chinese, right? And there's a picture, Chinese bodies, right, on the floor, right? And like I said, this was an early example of that violence because it isn't until later that we see this kind of culmination at the grassroots level first, at the local level, and eventually culminating with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, where you see this kind of this growing anti-Asian sentiment, right, directed at the Chinese that LA has, like I said, an early example of that. All right, so let me switch back. So a year later, 1872, and this is a letter to the editor. So this is a piece that I found is interesting because it tells the story. It's one kind of way of looking at the story of Calle de los Negros. And so one of the things that I focused on in my research was, how did this street that was originally during the Mexican period called Calle de los Negros, right, where did it come from? how did it become the main street of the Chinatown, right? And really, for decades, was the main street of the Chinatown, right? Calle de los Negros. So this is a letter to the editor, Los Angeles Express newspaper, March 24th, 1872. So let me read it to you. Up here. As the council have passed a resolution to abolish the name of Negro Alley, it may interest your readers to know the origin of the name. In early times, the streets were not named, with the exception of Main Street, and the others were designated by the name of someone living in the same. The word negro, as used by the Spaniards, is applied to persons of dark complexion, whether of African or European origin, and by both was regarded as a term of reproach. Some 35 years ago, the property on Negro Alley was owned by some of the most substantial citizens of Los Angeles, and all of them, with one exception, were together with their tenants, men of very dark complexion. So this, speaks pretty much truthfully in terms of, as we saw from the Massacre 4, in terms of the people that lived there, the property owners, and the idea that you could have someone like Pio Pico, right, who was a prominent property owner, not just in Los Angeles, but prominent here in in San Diego, the big chunk of North County, right, very wealthy along with his family members, and who was also mulatto, right? He was Afro-mestizo, right? So that made sense too in terms of men of very dark complexion. One morning when the people arose, they found a placard put up on each end of the alley bearing the words Calle de los Negros. The dwellers of the street were highly indignant and soon traced the authorship to the placard to Don Jose Antonio Carrillo, right? And they forthwith had him cited before the alcalde, the mayor. When he was asked what he had to say for himself, he answered he thought that the street ought to have a name, that it would be invidious to name it for any particular one living on the street, as they were all negros alike. That the name of the street was an appropriate one, and in proof of his assertion, offered in evidence the complexion of the complainants then before the alcalde. The complaint was dismissed, but the name then given has stuck until the present time. So here we have the origins of Calle de los Negros, right? This kind of initial naming of the street connected to the Spanish, the Mexican period, right? And really as translated as something not that bad, right? In the context of the casta, right? That it was, well, they're all negros alike, right? And that's not necessarily totally bad in terms of the way that we look at it, but what we'll see is the difference in terms of translation. So that's the thing that I look at, is by 1872, we begin to see how the physical environment and the community environment where the Chinese and the Mexican lives was starting to be transformed in a significant way, more so than it ever before in terms of trying to reorganize the physical space, right? Create a more kind of literally just straightening the streets out, right? Regrading the street. And so what I did is I looked at these maps from this period on to kind of see, well, how are these changes named, right? And so here's a map of the city, right? This is from 1873. There's the Plaza. So here you go, starting with the Plaza, it takes shape in different ways. And one of the ways it shapes, and you can see this in a lot of old pictures of the Plaza from the late 19th and early 20th century, is it begins to look more like a park, right? It begins to become bordered off, right? There's grass there, there's sidewalk there, as opposed to kind of a marketplace or an open space, a bullfighting arena, right? And there you have Calle de los Negros, right? So there's Calle de los Negros coming into the Plaza. There's Calle Principal, Main Street, right? Wine Street, which later becomes known as Olvera Street, and there's Alameda Street, which is still right there. Here's a picture from 1882, so a couple of years later. Right? So here's a photograph of the same street of Calle de los Negros. So here's Calle de los Negros leading into the Plaza. So the Plaza area is over here. When you go visit Olvera Street, you'll notice this building is still there. This is the old fire station that's on one edge of the Plaza. So the Plaza is kind of behind this old adobe, but this kind of gives you a sense, right? Dirt street, a lot of carriages, right? This is right Main Street kind of at this point, and at this point was the center of the original Chinatown, right? And also at this point had already started to be translated and known as not just Negro Alley or Calle de los Negros, but also Nigger Alley, right? And so what I want to kind of jump into is kind of the racialization of that. Is that wasn't a mistake, it wasn't kind of a mistranslation. In reality, this was a very conscious decision by the city council, right? Business owners, property owners, to rename and reimagine the narrative and the story of the street. So for instance, and this was pretty glaring, right? So 1888, right, going into the 1880s and 1890s, Jakob Kurtz, who's a former LA City Councilman, chairman of the Board of Public Works, was appointed the new superintendent of streets. Okay? So Mr. Kurtz's first goal was extending Los Angeles Street, right? So this is part of the strategy for urban renewal, but also a very public and clear strategy of dealing with the Chinatown, right? Because this is Los Angeles Street ran adjacent to Calle de los Negros, which later became Negro Alley, which later became Negro Alley. Okay? And this is what he said, right, when he was given the job. January 10th, 1888, LA Times. Yes, I'm glad to inform you that I attacked the Great Mongol tomorrow. We are about to extend Los Angeles Street, and I will tear down all that part of the long, festering rookery that stands in the way. I would like to tear down every vestige of it, but with the central portion rooted out and Los Angeles Street cut through and built up, Chinatown will speedily disappear. Right? So here you have, right, the superintendent of streets saying this is the primary goal. And this is not unusual, right? By 1888, right, this kind of attack, right, physical attack, symbolic attack, passing of laws against the Chinese on different parts of the United States and different cities like Los Angeles was already taking place. Chinese were being burned out, Chinese were being kicked out, right? There was laws that were being passed regulating their occupancy, right, of where they could live, what occupations they could work at, etc. Right? 16 years later. So this is a piece that was published in the Historical Society of Southern California's annual publication in 1907. So this is what Kurtz said. It was a piece looking at some of the founders, right, of the modern Los Angeles. So the late 1870s, the 1880s, there was a boom, right? It's kind of boom and bust of Los Angeles, but this growth of the modern city, right? The founding of USC in 1880, they always said. So this is what Kurtz said, right? This is the same guy. Quote, I hired about 100 men, and on a certain morning had them on the ground by 4 o'clock with battering rams and other instruments. And by 10 o'clock in the morning, I had raised nearly every building between Arcadia Street and the Plaza, when an injunction was filed upon me by Colonel G. Wiley Wells, attorney for Mrs. Bigelow. Mrs. Bigelow was one of the property owners adjacent to Los Angeles Street and Calle de los Negros. So, but the mischief was done, and Los Angeles Street was opened as it is today. Okay? So, I mean, here representing kind of the physical reorganization, the changing in the built environment with the idea of wanting to kind of push out and reorganize, right, the space. So going back to sandboard maps, I'll show a couple sandboard maps. These maps are great if you do research on urban centers. These maps go back, how far back? Go back to the 19th century. And these are fire insurance maps. So they're great maps because they give you information on the physical buildings. So what the buildings are made out of, if they're brick, if they're wood, and their usage. So you can get a lot of information from these kinds of maps. And here we have the Plaza, right? There's Los Angeles Street, which Kurtz had helped. So Los Angeles Street extended this way, right? At a certain point, this was Calle de los Negros, right? So this had been reorganized, right, shifted, and it becomes an extension of Los Angeles Street, right? If you can get it, we'll get a closer picture of some of these other buildings. You're going to see some of the designations. For most of the buildings on this side were Chinatown, right? So it says there Chinatown, right? Chinese housing. There was also designations for things of vice, female bordering houses, which essentially meant really prostitution, other things are happening, right, in that as they were listed. Right? So at the same time that the Chinese are being pushed out, they're being burned out, their streets are being reorganized, and all these things happening by the city council and the modernization. The Chinese were still there. Right, the Gardere building on one side of Los Angeles Street. This building is pretty important because it's the last building of the old Chinatown that still exists today. So if you go there today, of all the square blocks that where it was Chinatown, the only ones that's there that were used during this period is right there on the Plaza. But just to give you a sense that this was an active community in the 1890s, right? The heart of the Chinatown. Chinese parade happening, right? Around there's the Gardere building on this side. Right? 1890s also, the Gardere building is on this side of the street. This is the extension of Los Angeles Street. The Plaza is right here on this side. And this is a picture of the Lugo House, right? So this is that 2-story adobe Lugo House. The Lugo family was a prominent California family, right? This building was used as the home for St. Vincent's College for a time, and which is a precursor to Loyola Marymount University. It was also becomes part of the Chinatown. And here is a photograph, right? Adobe home to the Li Qing Hung and Company. So, at the bottom floor would be the businesses, and the top floor would be housing, right? So going back to the sample maps a couple years later, 1894, we see the extension of Los Angeles Street, right? Kind of even more in depth in terms of clearing out of more land, right? But what interestingly happens, right, is that along with the erasure and the changing of the streets, like Los Angeles Street becoming, erasing essentially Calle de los Negros, the city council, LA City Council decides to rename the streets, right? So along with renaming the extension of Los Angeles Street, they actually, even after it was disappeared, it was recreated, they created Nigger Alley, right? Officially. And I mean, so you say, what is that? Well, it's the translation, Calle de los Negros, Negro, but it's also a very clear indication of kind of the racist mentality, right? Of the kind of the normalized way of thinking, of connecting that kind of a translation to the heart of the Chinatown. See, in this picture, you can kind of see better. It's like a Chinese quarter, right? It says there, and it tells you the names of some of the businesses, right? The Gardere Block, so that's the building I said was kind of prominent. So of all of Chinatown, the only ones that are left are these buildings. In the Gardere building today is the Chinese American Museum. That's on the Plaza. So the Plaza is right there. So another picture, right? 1900, still Chinese. This is the heart of the Chinatown, right? This is the Gardere building in this area. 1906. Here the city is still working, redesigning, kind of narrowing off the streets coming into the Plaza, but still, I put this there, you can still see, right, Nigger Alley is there, right, this is Arcadia Street that runs into that, Alameda Street is here, and the Plaza is on this side. Right. In the 1920s, still, this is the heart of the Chinatown, a Chinese community. You can look at what I looked at business directories to see where businesses, what the names of the businesses were located, organizations that were in and around this area, and what you find is an extensive web of Chinese-related community and other Asian group-related, Japanese as well, in and around this area. So you have a Chinese YMCA, you have the Chinese Presbyterian Church, right? And this is in the early 1920s. So this is looking on to Calle de los Negros, also known as Negro Alley. Okay, this is a great picture because 1931, this gives you a sense, right, of the depth. So the street that we were just looking at, the man was standing right here. Right? He was standing right there. The entry point to Calle de los Negros or Nigger Alley. Right? But this was an extensive kind of warehousing and housing that we had here. Right? That's Alameda Street there. So this is a picture right before the building up and the destruction of the entire Chinatown. To welcome in the Union Station, right? So Union Station was the last of the great Union, basically uniting the railroad stations into the center, the heart of downtown Los Angeles. All of this land was demolished. And to make way for that Union Station. So the Chinese were pushed out, were kicked out, were removed from the original area that they were in Los Angeles and moved to a different part of the Plaza, which is currently where they're at. So in the 1930s, what you had was this removal of the Chinese, the creation of the Union Station, and the creation of a place called New Chinatown and China City. So by the late 1930s, that Chinatown, like I said, that's there today, that's what was built. And it was built in this kind of Chinese fantasy mythology, kind of in a similar way to the way in which Olvera Street, the Olvera Street Marketplace was opened in 1930 on the Plaza. It kind of used the kind of the vogue of things Mexican of the 1920s, this notion of kind of this mission myth, this mission mythology of the aesthetic, of the sense of history, of this kind of Spanish colonial romanticizing of the narrative, and it made it very tourist friendly on this real historical space. Right? So Olvera Street opens in 1930, the Chinatown in China City in the late 1930s. Right? So here's the Gardere building, so that same building, right? You're saying there's there's City Hall, the modern City Hall in the background there. right? So in the 1940s, these buildings are still there today. That's what it looks like. So there's nothing really left around except that one building. All right, so O'Vara Street, Chinatown. The same city mothers and city fathers that invested in kind of crafting these narratives during this time period worked on both, right? The idea that you could have, designating or saving this kind of historical legacy of the space of the old Pueblo, so that future generations could appreciate it and understand it, but in a very kind of Disneyland-esque kind of mission myth way, right? Christine Sterling, who was one of the founder, the person that really pushed for the saving of the Plaza area and the creation of O'Vara Street, was very strict about who her vendors could be, right? What could be sold there, the different kind of apparel that they needed to have, the aesthetic that they wanted to represent. Right? Once again, this is the early 1930s, right? The late 1920s, early 1930s. The Great Depression has been pushed in, right? It's happening. You have the repatriation of Mexicans and Mexican Americans that's happening as well. Interestingly enough, on the Plaza was one of the sites where you have one of those famously publicized raids, where you had Mexicans and Mexican Americans and others that were rounded up and literally walked across the street to the train station, right, and shipped and deported, right, to Mexico. So that's being part of the narrative there. So in a sense, you have this kind of postcard version of the history of 1930, but not necessarily with the Mexicans. So it's kind of like it's the food, it's the music, it's all the things we love, right? That people love about Mexican culture, and even more so in terms of kind of this romanticized mission myth about it, but without the Mexicans, right? 2 years later, 1932, America Tropical is painted. This is a mural that's painted on what's today known as the Italian Hall on the Plaza. Okay, this was painted by David Alfaro Siqueiros, who was one of Los Tres Grandes, the three giants of Mexican muralism. Okay, so along with everyone knows, Rivera, right? There's Orozco and Siqueiros. Well, this is a piece that he painted in 1932. David Alfaro Siqueiros was invited to Los Angeles to teach a class on fresco painting, okay, at the Chouinard School of Art in downtown LA. And so he paints, works with students there. He was invited by this gallery owner who occupied the top hall of the Italian Hall and said, and commissioned to paint a tropical landscape for me. And then, once again, this was the time where things Mexican, especially Rivera, the muralist, were gaining popularity in the United States, from California to New York, right, etc. And so he's like, sure, I'll paint something. And so what Siqueiros does is he creates this tropical, America Tropical, this tropical landscape that's 18 feet tall, right? So it's about twice the size high of this wall and 80 feet long. So about 5 times the length of this room or so. Massive. This is really known as the first monumental work of public art in the city of Los Angeles at that scale. On a public wall, outside for everyone to see, and it painted it on the Plaza on O'Vara Street, right? So in 1930, O'Vara Street opens. In 32, during the Summer Olympics, when the eyes of the world are on LA, Siqueiros paints America Tropical. Almost immediately, right, the critical acclaim and the controversy begins, right, or started with this piece, because you have Siqueiros painting, right, this kind of tropical, Aztec or Mayan ruined building, right, pyramid. You see the ruins on the floor being overgrown by the jungle. And at the center is an indigenous person on a double cross. And at the top of it is the eagle of the American dollar, as Siqueiros said. And to the side of him are 2 soldiers, one in Mexican and a Revolutionary garb, another one in kind of a Jaguar indigenous garb, with a gun pointed at the eagle. Okay. Once again, 1932, this is 2 years after the creation of O'Vara Street. O'Vara Street is meant to be the tourist-friendly, historical, real historical, yet kind of very controlled historical space. Right, so I won't go. This is an article from the LA Times, Arthur Miller's review of the piece. Right, so the mural got a lot of critical acclaim. Right, it was like, wow, we've never seen anything like this. This is the first of its scale, of its kind. Siqueiros used new technology at the time. He used quick dry cement
So he didn't use a traditional fresco a technique that they borrowed, right? Rivera and others borrowed, from Renaissance paintings that they were doing in Mexico and other places. So it was a lot of critical acclaim, but also a lot of critique, especially from the city mothers and fathers that had just invested and created this notion of the Olvera Street, right? The Olvera Street Marketplace. So here's a picture of the original drawing of the soldiers, right? Just to give you a nice close-up, a nice piece, right? So you have the Mexican revolutionary with the bullets, right, and his rifle, and then the soldier, right, pointing the gun. The story goes that Siqueiros painted, right, the images that were here, and the central image the night before the mural was unveiled, right? So the drama behind it that went into the weeks that he worked on it with a group of painters on the Plaza. So here's a picture of the mural, right, 1933. Like I said, it's painted on the top floor of the Italian Hall. This is a picture from across the roof, right? You can see a little Budweiser sign there. But you can actually climb up those steps and see it. And so almost immediately, if you notice this portion of the mural was whitewashed, right? It was whitewashed over because that was the most controversial part. It was them holding the guns. But within a couple of years, the entire mural was whitewashed. So here's another piece. This is a period piece. You can see there's the mural. There's a whitewashed part, right? There's the steps people go up to see it. This is what it looks like today, right? There's the mural. It's after decades and decades, really starting in the 1960s, the Chicano movement, the civil rights movement. People are like, we have a Siqueiros mural, right? He painted 3 murals in Los Angeles. That's it. Siqueiros didn't paint any more murals in the city. When unlike Rivera and others that had were a lot more prolific in terms of their painting in the United States, Siqueiros wasn't. So the white paint is fading after decades of it's literally facing the sun, the water, and everything. It took a lot of politics between the community, between the city, between the state, between the arts community, the Getty, right? Big money coming in, finally building the structure to protect it from the elements. Even back right before Siqueiros passes away, he says, "I'll come back to Los Angeles and repaint it," because the piece was censored from the start, never really got its life, So, but he passes away before that happens. Anyway, it's like 3 years ago now. So this is where it looks like. So across that same roof, it's protected. You can't go up to it, and this is the viewing area to see the mural. You can kind of make that looks like an archaeological dig, a relic, right? And there's a really nice visitor center at the base of the building where this is at. Nice little museum that you can learn more about Siqueiros. So 1934, right, 2 years after Siqueiros paints, the street is still being reorganized. Here's a nice, better image of the Sanborn maps. Because it tells you garage, Chinese school, right, parlor, Chinese Presbyterian. And there you have, this was Calle de los Negros, this was Nigger Alley, right, now an extension of Arcadia Street, and the Plaza's on this side. And I love these Sanborn maps. This is pictures I took actually from the downtown public library, downtown LA, where they actually have copies of big Sanborn maps, and these big maps, it was before printing, before you could just print out a new copy. What they would do is, and you can see it really nicely here, they do like paper mache as the streets were changing, the buildings were changing, they paper mache over different parts of it and just add in, how it's changing. So you can see here, as, this is from 32, as this was changing, this part was changing, they kind of overlap, you can still see Nigger Alley there, right? So it's interesting, kind of the layers of history, even can't be erased even at that point. So from the 1930s to the 1950s, dramatic change in terms of what's happening, right? You go from the Great Depression to World War II to the politics of the Cold War, right? The image of Siqueiros' version, right, of the treatment of indigenous peoples, of Mexicans, right, at the heart of the city, right, where Mexicanos, not just Mexican and Chinese, but also European immigrants and people coming into the city, people coming through the train stations, right? We're seeing these images, right? In the narrative of Olvera Street being this very kind of capturing, as I said, this kind of mission mythology, and then Siqueiros kind of brushing up against that. By the 1940s, right? There's the Grand Tower of the Union Station, which is in the background. It's a beautiful building. Like I said, this is a remarkable place to go check out. The Union Station is tremendous. You've probably seen it in commercials and movies. It's an old school Art Deco building. But by the 1940s, the narrative, still to this day, it's interesting doing the research, the narrative of LA history is that the old Chinatown is gone. Well, in fact, it wasn't gone. It was still there. The remnants of the buildings were still there. The Gardere building on this side was still there. All of these buildings that were all occupied, as you can see from the signage, right, by the Chinese, right? Chinese arts, right? Says this sign says Old Los Angeles. This was actually Calle de los Negros, right there, Negro Alley, right? And this is Los Angeles Street. But by the late 1940s, there's the Lugo House. Okay, there's that two-story adobe, and you can see it. You know, underneath all the wood, and it's the adobe. It's still there, right? The brick buildings, right? The dry goods den, Chinese food, right? This is the heart, still the heart of the old Chinatown. What happens is by the 1940s, you have the reorganization of this area and the consolidation of what becomes the Pueblo, the historical monument that exists today as a state entity, kind of like Old Town San Diego. And what the city mothers and fathers decided was that all of this was expendable, was not historically useful, and did not need to be saved, right? Because what was coming in was the Hollywood Freeway. And so what they did is they decided, well, let's just knock it all down, right, so that we can build, you know, and direct the entry point to the Hollywood Freeway, which is in and around this area, actually. And all of this becomes a park. So if you go there today, you'll see the park. And Christine Sterling, the founder of Rivera Street, is quoted as saying, well, it's better that way because then we get a clear view of the modern Union Station. Right? Whereas today, we think, wow, you know, if that would have been left there, so here we go, right? Here's that same street. These were all the buildings, and this was Calle de los Negros. There's the plazas on this side. All of that was just erased, right? There's the Hollywood Freeway. All of this could have been saved, kind of like the Gaslamp district here in San Diego could have been used in the same way, the same kind of historical narrative that was predominantly Mexican and Chinese, but also interconnected with other groups that had crisscrossed through the plaza, French, Italians, and others. And on with this, just a couple of recommendations. Some really good books that speak, if you're at all interested in LA history, it's one of those things where you can just keep talking and talking and talking, but I'm going to stop. And there's a lot of things you can focus on. You can focus on all different aspects, but some of the better books and studies on Los Angeles Plaza by William Estrada. Dr. Estrada is the director of the Science Center. Well, he's the director at the Natural History Museum of their archives that are housed there. Rebirth by Douglas Monroe is a great book. Also, Whitewashed Adobe by William Deverell. This is a really great book too. He's actually working on, he's a scholar at USC and at the Huntington Library. He's working on a multi-part documentary that's going to be coming out pretty soon. KPBS kind of thing, so watch out for it. Looking at what he calls as the whitewashed adobe, the narrative, kind of the history of the Pueblo, right, and the remaking of its Mexican past. Also more local UCSD person, Phoebe Crook, and her work, she went to graduate school there. And then the latest study on Chinatown, the Chinese Massacre, Chinese Los Angeles, Scott Zacia's work in 2012. So if you're at all interested in any of that, please let me know and I can get in touch with you. I'm here, so my email is, you can look me up, see Professor Lopez, Chicano Studies homepage.
Could you tell us where your work here was published?
Oh, sure, yeah. And so this work is based on a study in the Southern California Quarterly. So this is the journal. It's actually a piece. It has a really nice image. I'll bring it up in a second of Calle de los Negros. But it was published 2 years ago in the Southern. So if you're interested, I can send you a copy of the work, but it's also here in the library as well. Right, so it's a piece of the dissertation, as I said, that really started as a student, as an undergraduate student, that kind of worked its way into my thinking and kind of building this kind of comparative ethnic studies project that I worked on. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah, I have a comment and a couple of questions. Comment is, you might check out the current issue just came out of the Reviews of American History. There are 2 books on the racialization of California. One of them focuses particularly on Los Angeles and mentions the 1871 strike. And one of the points it makes is that the whites at that point decided to blame the riot on Mexicans and leave the whites out of it. Later on, the whites took claim for the riots against the Chinese. So that was part of this demonizing groups and divide and conquer. I wanted to ask, because you keep referring to the fathers or the officials. So who owned that land?
From the early U.S. period, it was the Californios, and there was an exchange of land. I mean, part of the famous story about Pio Pico is he sold off the San Fernando Valley, right, to pay for his Pico House on the Plaza, and he did, him and his brother and family. But essentially, it was mainly owned by Mexicanos or Californios all the way into the 1870s, and then it kind of dried up and it exchanged, crisscrossed. There was French owners, more American owners, and with the intention, though, I think one of the example that I gave of the Bigelow, this woman who was a property owner on Calle de los Negros, these were property owners that they had the intention of building up these properties so that the Chinese could live there. So I mean, they were intended for Chinese quarters. I mean, that was the idea, and so that's why they set them up in the way they did, with the ability for businesses at the bottom and the housing at the top. I mean, it was, that's what they were doing. So it was the politics of the city that interrupted kind of the capitalism of the building up and wanting to develop that area for that purpose. Yeah. But I mean, some of the more prominent Californios, they owned, like up until the 1870s, it was the coroners, adobe that's part of one of the pictures, and one of the main parts of the street were still Mexican owned. Yeah, but by the 1870s, that dropped off really fast.
Especially with riots and whatnot.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point you made. One of the things that I saw was in the coroner's inquest, because they did a coroner's inquest of the bodies. Because the 18 to 19, it's a little. Some people say 18. I've seen as high as 21 Chinese bodies that were killed. They interviewed people, and they interviewed people in English and Spanish, right? So you can see there was witnesses and participants, right? There were obviously, could be Californios that were, European that still spoke Spanish, but Mexicanos as well. And they said, the details of cutting people off, their fingers off, for the rings, and the kind of grotesqueness of the coroner's report. But it was also interesting to see that the languages that were used, right? So it tells that story a bit in terms of who participated and then who was kind of scapegoated in the end about it. Because what I saw was I just tried to see, well, what is the history of the businesses and how did they change and of the organizations there. So I listed all of that for the late 19th into the early 20th century to get a sense of who was actually occupying the buildings and some of what they were using it for. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for sharing your work. I guess I wanted to ask about, you mentioned the deportation rates that happened in 29, and then also the following year is when La Frontera opens up. And so I'm interested in that juxtaposition, right? Does it read to you as a kind of irony or contradiction, or was it very much on purpose to build this monument to Mexican culture at the same time they've just taken 500,000 folks out of the city?
Yeah, well, a couple things. I mean, one of the ways that, I think of Ronaldo Rosaldo's work as an anthropologist at Stanford talks about an imperialist nostalgia. And in the sense that you have, the colonial idea of like I said, the mission myth, the things that people love about, Mexican culture or Spanish culture. Or, we still have, for instance, like the fiestas every summer in Santa Barbara, right? So it's kind of reenactment. And even here, we love things. People love things Mexican, but not necessarily Mexicans themselves. And they become, especially in times of recession or depression. And with the Great Depression, it was an issue of buildup. By the mid 1920s, Mexicans started to be seen as a liability. Right. Before that, it was Eastern and Southern European immigrants that was a target. It was Chinese for sure, and other Asian immigrants. But as the booming 1920s, as more kind of migration and also immigration of Mexicans coming into parts of Southern California, but around the nation, there was a backlash, right? And part of that starts bubbling up, kind of just like today we talk about immigration. We look at kind of the grassroots of bubbling up of insurgents, things like the Minutemen and others, and then that leads to the politician and leads to places like Arizona and even like Prop 187 here in California in the 90s. So the kind of repatriation of Mexicans, that goes all the way to President Hoover, that period, and kind of blaming Mexicans as part of the problem and as extendable, right? And then bringing in things like that their the cost of relief, to things like their racial undesirability, right? Kind of racism always poking its head there. And I think the timing with Olvera Street in terms of creating it in 1930 is just it was a timing issue. The 1920s was a big period of, like I said, there's a book called The Vogue of Things Mexican. That's why I keep saying that phrase. That looks at the 1920s as a period where you had, from Hollywood to even to the built environment, you could live in, a Spanish-style home, right? You can go to North Park or South Park here in San Diego, and you can see the houses, that were built in the mission style. You can physically become part of that kind of cultural presence and live in it even if you wanted to. But like I said, I think that the politics of immigration, the politics of kind of framing the Mexicans as a problem by the late 1920s, it clashes at the national level. And that Plaza, there's great studies, there's a couple good studies on it. The newspaper reports, if you look at the newspaper when the Plaza raids happened, they actually publicized it, that there were raids that were going to happen in and around the Plaza. So the idea is, once again, it's like I said, this kind of symbolic form of violence. You don't need to kill everyone. You can have a matanza, right, a massacre, or you can have a lynching, or you can have a raid that's very public with the intention of intimidating people, scaring people, keeping people in their place. And I think that's part of what some of these raids that happened then were about. Even today, you see sometimes raids happening on the trolleys or that are publicized, that are on YouTube, and they become these kind of markers for the pushback or the backlash. More recently, there's the creation right across the street on the plaza of this plaza. It's called the Plaza Mexican Cultural Center, and it's essentially a Mexican history museum, but it's kind of couched in the way that we like to do these things, kind of couched in the language of food, culture, and arts. So it's not literally called the Mexican History Museum, but it's housed in an old building from the late 19th century, right across the plaza, really right next to the old church. And essentially it is like a museum. They do museum work, but it's a very, like right now they're kind of gearing up for Dia de los Muertos. So if you go there, check out, the plaza area, the Plaza Olvera, is alive with events that are community-based, rallies, politicians, official stuff, corporate stuff, grassroots stuff. One of the other things that I mentioned, that was mentioned about my research is I do research on the merchants of Olvera Street. So the merchants going back to the 1930s. So along with the idea that it's kind of like I said, it's kind of like this Disneyland-esque Fantasyland, like very like tourist-friendly place. It's also an interesting, very real historical place that's very layered. And one of those layers are the workers, because Christine Sterling, who was the founder of Olvera Street, like I said, she kind of picked out different people. This is where your puesto's going to be. This is where your shop's going to be. And many of the families going back to the 30s and 40s and 50s have kept on there. And so this is a space that's owned by the city. Owned by the state, but managed by the city, and it's kind of a lot of politics there. But the businesses have been passed on, right? So one of the narratives or the studies that I'm looking at is looking at what is that like for them to kind of be the agents of history in a place that's been very sanitized and controlled in terms of what history can come out of there. So it's like almost like they're making their own history because their businesses have been there. They've been the spokespeople really for the plaza for generations. And so there's people there that have, like I said, passed on, intermarried, divorced, cousins. It's pretty messy too.
But they remain tenants.
They remain tenants. Yeah. And then most recently with the Great Recession, there's a kind of a downwave in terms of or challenges to them as tenants because they wanted to raise the rents, right? This kind of history, this kind of a place, I would argue any kind of like plaza space or historical layered place like that is fraught with politics, right? In terms of who gets to tell a history, what museums go up, right? How do you tell the story? What historical moment you focus on? Like I was saying, one of the new museums that's being built in the Italian Hall is a museum to Italian Americans. And the Italian Americans had a presence on the plaza really in the 19-teens and early 1920s. Then they kind of moved off the Plaza, what became Little Italy, which is kind of now kind of gone for the most part. But there's going to be a museum there. There's also a big a moment of a significant French presence on the Plaza. And so are they going to build a French? So there's like, so it's kind of carving your space of history. But at the same time, part of why I did this study was to look at and to kind of build kind of the narrative of why isn't there a Mexican museum at the heart of the Pueblo, right? There was a Chinese museum before even the Mexican museum. So it's interesting, when you look at it from that perspective, and then you talk to the workers there, you talk to the people that are actually trying to make a living, right, kind of telling these stories, and then you talk to the politicians, and you talk to the administrators. Like I said, it's a very messy place, to work on and to work through, but fascinating to look at history. But for me, I stopped in I guess a certain point, and then I wanted to kind of go more modern, I guess, in terms of like oral histories of emergence, as opposed to, kind of doing more comparative work and comparative study. Yeah. But in terms of the development of the Plaza, one of the things I mentioned early on is the influence of kind of the European, kind of the plan of the Indies, and the specs that you would use to create the Plaza orientation, along with the kind of pre-Columbian connection. There's a lot more research on that now, looking at the influence of the kind of hybriding of plaza spaces in a way that didn't really exist in Europe at the time, but kind of evolves in the Americas. So there's definitely that. And I'm really fascinated by like built environment questions and how they transforms communities. Yeah. And one of the things, the points of this piece too is that, if you notice, I didn't say it explicitly, but you had the Chinese essentially be racialized as black, right? They lived on Calle de los Negros, right? They were, quote, the residents of Negro Alley, right? They became the targets of kind of racist sentiments of the late 19th century. If you were to in order to understand the Chinese, you would have to look at the experience, you look at through the lens of African Americans, American Indians, and there's these great political cartoons by Thomas Nast during this time period of the 1880s, 1890s that kind of looks to that. It's kind of an interesting comparative ethnic studies view on the language that was used to identify the characteristics of the Chinese in comparison to African Americans, in comparison to American Indians. Yeah.
So if the Chinese were considered blacks as well, just as the Mexicans, like just people of color in general, how were they able to establish Chinatown for themselves and not Blacktown or Mexican town?
So how did, well, because part of it is they were relegated to particular parts of the city, right? So they weren't allowed to kind of spread out in different places. So part of this kind of ethnic enclave became, as a result of, that's where they were allowed to live, and that's where they were pushed to live. At the same time, you had, like I said, city fathers and city officials even, and vigilantes kind of trying to push them out and erase them.
And you might even point out that schools were often segregated and designated as the Oriental School, or so it was pretty intensive.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. And it was different in terms of the racialization for Mexicans and Mexican Americans at this point, who were officially legally white. See, come to my class, check out. Legally white, so their kind of racialized designation was different, but the orientation in terms of how they were being pushed from the legal system to our kind of common sense was as non-white, or as racially othered. And so their treatment, also fell under, kind of the guise of segregation, Mexican schools, right? American Indian, reservation schools, right? Off the res, and of course, segregation for African Americans. Yeah, so there's a lot of parallels for sure. But like I said, in terms of why the Chinatown grew there is because that's where they were pushed and allowed.
Not as why they're pushed. Like, how were they able to just establish Chinatown? Because you think of the Black community or the Latino community. I don't know. Were they better established in a way? Were they able to create their Chinatown? You don't hear Mexican town, or am I making
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah. No, well, there were Mexicans in and around. They lived on the Pueblo, and then later they kind of moved out. But I think in a way it would be seen, it's kind of not a good thing that there was in a sense, like kind of an isolated Chinatown. That's kind of default. The Mexican community also had, a portion of the downtown Plaza area, and then later moving on into the east side, of Los Angeles, really by the turn of the century. And then another question I get is in terms of African Americans, right? Kind of Calle, Negros. They're really in Los Angeles. You don't have African Americans there. at least in this kind of downtown area until the 19-teens and 1920s, kind of the Great Migration period coming from the south and stuff. The Chinese were seen as, as the worker bees. I mean, they were coming in from different parts, the railroads and others, but they were very much controlled. There was laws and ordinances that were, that controlled the type of the employment and businesses they could have, the types, the living spaces that they could be in. And then you see that in San Francisco, you see it in LA. I mean, that's the Tong story going back to the Chinese Massacre. This kind of relation, this kind of animosity and competition between them in terms of controlling. So I mean, yeah, they were able to kind of be controlling of their own space, but it was from the outset it was very controlled and limited. Like I said, to the point where vigilante violence was common, and city ordinances were intent on trying to drive them out.
It's probably the Japanese more than anyone who were glorified as being the ideal race, because they were supposed to be better and different from the Chinese. So they supplant the Chinese as the chief labor force, and the justification of bringing them in talks about how they're a super race. They're like the Yankees. And then, of course, within 10 to 15 years, all that propaganda changes too, and they're all seen as, insects and the yellow peril and all the rest that people like Hearst make such a point of.
Great, yeah.
So in terms of the plaza itself, it seems like it went through lots of restructurizing along the way. In the most recent years, has there been talks about possibly like tearing it down or rebuilding over it? I just asked because when I moved from Anaheim to San Diego County in like the early 90s, I remember my parents being really upset because they heard that the city wanted to build over it or tear it down and put like hotels and businesses that would possibly thrive better.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, a lot of what's happening in and around the plaza, the physical, I guess the boundaries that I showed you guys, those are pretty set, right? Because those are, the historical designation part of Pueblo Historical Monument. But in and around, like literally right across the street from where the Union Station is at, all along Alameda Street, going down Alameda towards Little Tokyo, even where right across from where the old post office is, all around that area has been and will continue to be redeveloped. There's apartments, studios, businesses. So there's a big push for live loft kind of places. It's becoming very trendy, and so that's definitely happening.
Skid Row's not far away.
Yeah, Skid Row. Yeah, it's actually
a
couple blocks away is Skid Row and all that. But yeah, I mean, but it definitely is one of those places. There's even more development on the Chinatown side of it as well. Was part of a group that's working on a big funding grant to work on more apartments, right? That can be multi-use, high-density apartments, and they want to include some of the kind of historical connection to the plaza in these buildings that are literally going to be on the other side of the old church, right? On lots that are now parking lots, big area parking lots, but basically part of Chinatown. And so it doesn't stop there. In terms of the actual physical plaza, one of the things that's been debated, and this has kind of gone away now, but I'm talking about 10 years ago, where in the midst of the recession, really even further back, in terms of like post 9/11, the economy was going down there, and one of the things they've been wanting to and pushing back against is corporate development, redevelopment. People have been to like malls that are, like in Pasadena, there's an outdoor mall that was kind of idealized, kind of beautiful mission kind of style. Well, they were talking about bringing in corporations to kind of revamp and renew Olvera Street. Olvera Street, as I said, founded in 1930. The majority of the buildings there on Olvera Street are warehouses and buildings that were from the 1880s, 1890s, and turn of the century. In terms of Mexican buildings, the Villa Adobe, there's only one left. That building, the church, the original church from the Mexican period, the Pueblo House from 1870. That's during the U.S. period. The majority of the buildings are actually made to look kind of like historicized, and they're all fluffed up and a lot of decoration. But these buildings they're old. By the 1920s, this was really was an alleyway, was a warehouse way where a lot of businesses. There was the old church is there. There's the old electrical house for the trolley station. There's a trolley, officially called it, an electrical house where they house the trolleys, right? The old trolley system that used to run all over Southern California. So these buildings, like I said, they're turn of the century buildings.
Is tourism, it's kind of like World's Fairs, because they did the same thing at World's Fairs, creating, exotic areas for people to go see, cultures on display.
Yeah.
It also precedes Disneyland, which does some of the same for Americana.
Yeah. But how would you like to go to Old Town and go to the Adobe there and it says sponsored by Taco Bell? Like what kind of, I don't know, maybe you like that experience, or I know I went out to the way to Vegas, like a Calico, people went out to the Calico ghost town, right, on your way to Vegas. And just a couple of years, I don't know where it's at right now, but a couple of years ago, I think that was sponsored by Knott's Berry Farm. So they fixed it up. They made it look nice, old, right? So that means modern restrooms. That means, if you talk, here's another side. If you talk to the merchants about this issue, right? So that's, this is their livelihood. Some of them, they're real divided. Some of them love the idea, like, yeah, finally, let's get some working restrooms in here. Finally, it's kind of one of those places where when you walk through it as a kid or as a tourist, you have your little taquitos, kind of like you do your tortillas here at Old Town, right? Whatever, that kind of stuff. But if you don't, as long as you don't stop too long to stare, everything kind of looks very splashy with color and all kinds of artesanías and curios and all that kind of stuff, piñatas, Mexican candy. But if you really stop and just sit there and kind of look around and see, oh wow, the floors are cracking. Oh, there's a missing part of the sidewalk here. Oh, the bathrooms don't flush. Oh, all the little things in terms of the physical, run of the mill. If you think of it as a business, it's like, and the business owners are like, yeah, it would be great to kind of bring in an influx of money, but then that will take away. Then they would have to give up some of their tenant rights. Right, so it's also kind of from that standpoint, as tenants, they pay lower than market value rent because it's one of those places. It's a boom and bust kind of thing. Some of the businesses do really well, especially on the edges of Olvera Street. Some of the ones in the middle are suffering a little bit more, and some have gone out of business after generations. So it is a controversial thing, right? When you look at what do you want, authenticity? Well, in the end, Olvera Street in itself is authentic to the 1920s or 30s, right, in terms of how it was imagined, right? So you got to kind of dig a little deeper to get at some of the more historical narratives during the Mexican period or Spanish colonial period. But yeah, it's fraught with like the politics of that. Do you want, and then, like I said, the merchants are very divided about that, and it's still going on. Yeah, there's a lot of money involved as well. Any other questions? Well, like I said, I think, hopefully I've inspired you or not scared you, or in terms of visiting the Pueblo, visiting Olvera Street. It's a great road trip. Go see the Cicada's mural. Go into the old church. That's not a mission. It's not one of the mission churches. It's a satellite to the San Gabriel Mission, so go to the San Gabriel Mission as well. Go to the Chinese American Museum. Go to Los Angeles Street and walk on Calle Los Negros. Look at the buildings that, you knew there were once awesome, cool buildings that we could have been, occupying right now with some great museums and great things that are no longer there, but there's still a lot of history there. It's still it's LA history, so there's always going to be more. Well, thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it.